Stop the car, or she dies tonight. The words hit the inside of the limousine like a crack through glass, sharp and impossible to ignore as Richard Coleman slowly lifted his eyes from the glowing tablet in his lap, the city lights sliding across the tinted window in blurred streaks of gold and red, his driver hesitating for half a second before easing off the accelerator, the engine dropping to a low hum while rain tapped steadily against the roof like a quiet warning. Sir, we should keep moving, the bodyguard muttered from the front seat, already tense, already calculating risk. But Richard didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the small figure outside, barely visible under the flickering streetlight, a thin girl standing barefoot on the wet pavement, her oversized hoodie clinging to her frame, her dark curls damp against her face. She didn't move closer, didn't beg, didn't wave her hands like someone asking for money. She just stood there, steady, waiting, like she had already decided he would stop. The driver glanced back again, uncertain now, and finally the limousine rolled to a complete stop, the world outside muffled, suspended, the soft click of the door unlocking breaking the silence as the window lowered an inch, then two, just enough for her voice to slip through. They took her, she said barely above a whisper, but it cut clean through the space between them. Richard's brow tightened, irritation flickering first, then something sharper. Who? He asked. His voice controlled, distant, the kind of voice that closed deals worth millions without ever rising. The girl stepped forward into the thin beam of light, her eyes lifting to meet his, not fearful, not pleading, just certain. The woman, your wife. The words landed heavier this time, and for a moment, something inside the car shifted, the air tightening, the bodyguard stiffening. That's enough, he said quickly, reaching for the door handle. But Richard raised a hand, stopping him without looking away. My wife is dead, Richard said, each word measured, final, the kind of truth he had repeated so many times and no longer felt like something that could be questioned. But the girl shook her head slowly, water dripping from her chin onto the concrete. Not where I sleep, she replied, her voice still quiet, still unwavering, the river wind rising behind her, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and something colder, deeper, something hidden. Richard felt it then, not belief, not yet, but a crack, a small fracture in the certainty he had built around himself for months, the kind of fracture that doesn't make a sound but changes everything. What's your name? He asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. The girl hesitated for just a second, then answered, Ava. And as the name settled between them, the rain seemed to soften, the city noise fading into the background, and somewhere beyond the road, past the dark stretch of trees, the river moved slowly, silently, like it was holding on to something it wasn't ready to give back. The silence stretched just a little too long, the kind that made even the rain seem quieter, as Richard Coleman studied the girl standing outside his car, her name still lingering in his mind like something unfinished. Ava, he repeated it once under his breath. Not out loud, just enough to feel its weight. She did not look away, did not shift nervously like most people did when faced with someone like him, someone with power stitched into every line of his tailored coat. Instead she stood still, water pooling around her bare feet, her shoulders squared against the cold as if she had learned long ago that discomfort was something you endured, not something you complained about. Where exactly is this river? Richard asked finally, his voice quieter now, less certain than before. The bodyguard turned his head sharply, surprised by the question, but said nothing. Ava lifted her hand slowly and pointed past the road, beyond the trees where the city lights faded into a darker stretch of land. 2 blocks down, then under the old bridge, she said, her voice steady. I stay there sometimes. Richard followed the direction of her finger, his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew that part of the city, not from experience but from reports, development plans, places marked for future projects but never quite reached, places that existed in the margins. And you saw someone there? He pressed. Ava nodded once, a small movement, but certain. Not just someone, she said. Her. The word hung between them, heavier now, more deliberate. Richard exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly against the glass, his mind pulling against itself, logic against instinct, memory against possibility. His wife had been gone for months. The searches, the reports, the closure statements, All of it had settled into a quiet finality he had forced himself to accept, and yet this girl, standing in the rain with nothing to gain, was speaking as if that ending had never happened. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, not harsh, not dismissive, but searching. Ava did not flinch, did not argue. She simply reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out something small, holding it carefully in her palm as she stepped closer to the window. The driver instinctively tensed, but Richard leaned forward, just enough to see. It was a piece of fabric, worn at the edges, pale blue, the kind of cloth that might have once been part of something delicate, something personal. Ava lifted it slightly, letting the dim street light catch the thread stitched into the corner, faint but still visible, a single initial. "I found this by the water," she said softly. She dropped it. Richard felt something shift again, deeper. This time, not a crack, but a pull, like something reaching from a place he had tried not to look at. He knew that color, that stitching, not exactly, not with certainty, but enough to recognize the familiarity, enough to make his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The bodyguard spoke again, more urgent now. "Sir, this could be anything. We should not stay here." But Richard did not respond, his attention still fixed on the small piece of fabric in the girl's hand. Ava watched him closely, not with expectation, not with hope, just with a quiet patience, as if she had already done her part and the rest was no longer up to her. The rain softened even more, the sound of it fading into the background as the world narrowed to that moment, that space between what was known and what might still be hidden, and for the first time in a long time, Richard did not feel in control of the answer. Richard did not reach for the fabric right away, his hand hovering just slightly above his knee, as if even that small movement required a decision he was not ready to make. The rain continued to fall in a soft, steady rhythm against the roof of the car, each drop sounding louder now that no one was speaking. Ava kept her arm extended, not pushing it closer, not pulling it back, simply holding it there with a patience that felt older than she was. "Where did you find it?" Richard asked at last, his voice lower, more measured. Ava glanced briefly toward the darkness beyond the road, her eyes tracing the invisible path she must have walked countless times. "By the rocks near the water," she said, "where the current slows down." Richard followed her gaze again, imagining the place, the way the river curved, the way things could gather there unnoticed. He had seen maps of the area, plans for redevelopment, clean lines drawn over spaces that did not fit into the city's version of order, but maps never showed what people left behind. "Why bring it to me?" he asked, his eyes returning to her, searching for something that would make sense of this. Ava shrugged slightly, a small motion beneath the damp fabric of her hoodie. "Because it is yours," she said simply, as if the answer needed no more explanation. The bodyguard shifted again, clearly uneasy now, his voice firmer. "Sir, we should verify this through proper channels. This is not safe." But Richard barely registered the words, his attention narrowing further, drawn into the quiet certainty in Ava's voice. "You knew who I was," he said, not quite a question. Ava nodded once. "People talk," she replied. "And your picture is on the signs downtown." Richard exhaled slowly, a faint, almost humorless breath. Of course it was. His world was built on being seen, recognized, followed, and yet here, in this moment, that visibility felt different, almost irrelevant. "And you just decided to stop me?" "In the street," he said. Ava met his gaze again, her expression unchanged. "I saw your car," she said, "and I knew you would listen if it mattered." Something in that sentence lingered, not the words themselves, but the way she said them, like a statement of fact, not hope, not assumption. Richard finally leaned forward, reaching out and taking the piece of fabric from her hand. It was lighter than he expected, damp, cool against his fingers. He turned it slightly, examining the stitching more. Not thought about in weeks, maybe months. His grip tightened just slightly, not enough to crease it, but enough to anchor himself to the moment. Ava lowered her hand, letting it fall back to her side. Her part finished for now. The driver glanced at Richard again through the rearview mirror, waiting, uncertain. The city lights flickered in the distance, but here, at the edge of the road, everything felt suspended. Like the world had narrowed to a single decision. Richard looked once more toward the direction of the river, the darkness there no longer just empty space, but something layered, something holding answers he had not been ready to look for. "Show me," he said finally, the words quiet but firm, and for the first time since she stepped into the light, Ava's expression shifted just slightly, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something deeper, something that said she had been waiting for that exact moment all along. The door opened with a soft, deliberate click, and for a moment, no one moved, the warm air inside the limousine spilling out into the cold night as Richard Coleman stepped onto the wet pavement, his polished shoes meeting the ground with a quiet certainty that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty in his chest. The bodyguard was out immediately after him, scanning the dark edges of the street, tension coiled in every movement. "Sir, this is not advisable," he said under his breath, but Richard did not respond, his eyes already shifting to Ava as she turned without a word and began walking toward the dim stretch of road that led away from the city lights, her pace steady, unhurried, as if she knew he would follow, and after only a second's pause he did, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the soft rhythm of rain and distant traffic, the limousine idling behind them like a tether to a world that suddenly felt far away. The street narrowed quickly, the pavement giving way to cracked concrete and patches of uneven ground, water pooling in shallow dips that reflected the faint glow of overhead wires. Ava moved carefully but confidently, stepping around puddles without looking down, her familiarity with the path evident in the way her body adjusted to every shift in the terrain. Richard noticed it, the way she did not hesitate, did not second-guess where to place her feet. This was not a place she visited, it was a place she knew. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, the question coming more from instinct than intention. Ava glanced back briefly, her expression unreadable in the low light. "Long enough," she said, and then faced forward again, the answer offering nothing and everything at once. The bodyguard stayed close, his presence a quiet shadow at Richard's side, his eyes constantly moving, measuring distance, exits, unseen corners. But the further they walked, the less the city seemed to exist. The sounds faded, the lights thinned, and the air shifted, cooler, heavier, carrying the faint scent of water and damp earth. Ahead, the outline of the bridge began to take shape, its steel frame cutting across the dark sky like a silent boundary. Ava slowed as they approached it, her steps more deliberate now, the ground beneath them softening slightly as it turned to packed dirt and gravel. "It is down there," she said, her voice lowering, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect, as if the place itself required it. Richard followed her gaze, the river barely visible at first, just a darker line against the shadows, until the faint movement of the water caught what little light remained, gliding slowly beneath the bridge, quiet and constant. He felt it again, that pull, stronger now, less like doubt and more like something drawing him forward whether he wanted it or not. Ava led them down a narrow slope toward the edge, her footing careful but sure, stopping near a cluster of rocks where the current slowed and curled inward. Just as she had described, she turned then, looking at Richard fully for the first time since they left the road, her eyes reflecting the dim light from above, steady and clear. "This is where I saw her," she said, and the words settled into the space between them with a weight that made everything else fall silent. Even the river seemed to hush for a moment, as if waiting to see what he would do next. Richard did not step closer right away, his gaze fixed on the slow, dark movement of the water as if it might answer him without words. The piece of fabric still held between his fingers, now heavier than it should have been. The air near the river felt different, colder, quieter, like the world had thinned out here and left only what mattered. Ava stood a few feet away, watching him but not interrupting, her presence steady, grounded, as if she understood that whatever came next did not belong to her to push. The bodyguard shifted uneasily behind Richard, his shoes crunching lightly against the gravel. "Sir, we should not stay exposed like this," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There is nothing here." Richard did not answer immediately, his eyes scanning the rocks, the shallow edge where the current slowed just enough to let things settle, his mind working against itself, trying to place logic over instinct, trying to return to the version of reality that had been signed, sealed, and accepted, but something refused to settle. Something kept pulling him back to the quiet certainty in Ava's voice. "You said you saw her," he said finally, turning slightly toward Ava. When? Ava looked toward the water, her expression softening just enough to suggest memory. 2 nights ago, she said. It was late, after the streetlights went out on the far side. Richard's jaw tightened. That was not possible, or at least it should not have been. And you are sure it was her? He pressed. Ava nodded once, slow and deliberate. She was wearing a coat, light-colored, and she kept holding on to something near her neck. Richard's fingers tightened instinctively around the fabric he held, the image forming in his mind without permission, too familiar to dismiss completely. The bodyguard stepped forward slightly, his tone firmer now. Sir, this could be coincidence. People lose things near water all the time. We need proper verification. But Richard barely registered the words, his focus narrowing again. Why did you not tell anyone else? He asked. Ava gave a small, almost tired exhale, not frustration, but something closer to acceptance. I tried, she said. People do not listen to someone like me. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight, not accusation, just truth. Richard felt it settle in, uncomfortable and undeniable. He looked at her then, really looked, the damp hoodie, the bare feet against the cold ground, the way she stood without asking for anything in return, and something in his posture shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to create space where doubt had been. He turned back toward the river, taking a slow step closer to the edge, the sound of water more distinct now, a soft, constant movement that seemed to carry secrets without effort. He crouched slightly, scanning the rocks more carefully, his eyes adjusting to the low light, searching for anything out of place, anything that did not belong. The seconds stretched, the air thick with quiet tension, until his gaze caught something faint near the edge of a flat stone, a small glint. Barely visible, he leaned forward just a fraction more, the shape becoming clearer, something metallic, something deliberate, and in that moment, the certainty he had been holding on to began to slip in a way that felt both terrifying and undeniable. Richard leaned in closer, the damp air brushing against his face as his eyes locked onto the faint metallic glint wedged between 2 stones, the river moving just inches away from it, as if guarding whatever had been left behind. His hand hovered for a moment before reaching forward, not out of hesitation, but out of something heavier, something that made even this small movement feel like crossing a line he could not step back from. The bodyguard shifted behind him, gravel crunching under his weight. Sir, let me handle that, he said quickly, but Richard shook his head once, barely, his focus unbroken, his fingers closing around the object with careful precision as he lifted it free from the damp surface. Water dripping lightly from its edges, he brought it closer to the faint light filtering down from the bridge above, turning it slowly between his fingers, and then he stopped, completely still, the world narrowing again, the river fading into the background, the sound of rain dissolving into silence. It was a pendant, small, gold, shaped with a delicate curve that caught the light just enough to reveal the engraved letters on its surface, the same letters he had traced countless times without thinking. The same letters he had once fastened gently around someone else's neck. His breath caught, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to break the steady rhythm he had been holding on to. The bodyguard stepped closer, his voice lowering, uncertain now. Sir? But Richard did not respond, his thumb brushing lightly over the engraving as if confirming what his eyes had already recognized, the certainty he had built around loss, around endings, around the clean finality of absence. It did not shatter all at once, it unraveled, thread by thread, in the quietest way possible. Behind him, Ava stood still, her arms resting loosely at her sides, watching not the object, but him, as if she understood that this moment was not about proof, but about realization. I told you, she said softly, not to convince him, not to claim anything, just to acknowledge what had already become undeniable. Richard finally exhaled, slow and uneven, his gaze lifting from the pendant to the dark stretch of water beyond, the current moving in its steady, indifferent way. But now it no longer looked empty, it looked like something that had held on to a truth longer than anyone else had been willing to. 2 nights ago, he repeated quietly, more to himself than to her, his mind racing through timelines, through reports, through everything that had been accepted without question, and now suddenly felt incomplete. The bodyguard straightened, his posture shifting from caution to urgency. "Sir, we need to call this in, this changes everything." But Richard remained where he was, still crouched near the edge, the pendant held firmly in his hand, his reflection faintly visible in the water beneath him, distorted by the slow movement of the current. He stared at it for a moment, as if trying to recognize the man looking back, the one who had been so certain, so controlled, and who now stood on the edge of something he could not fully see yet. Ava took a small step closer. Not invading the space, just enough to be heard without raising her voice. "They come back," she said quietly. "Not every night, but enough." Richard turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her from the corner of his eye, the weight of her words settling into place beside everything else, and for the first time since stepping out of the car, his certainty did not return. Instead, something else took its place, something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous, the realization that this was not over, that whatever had been hidden here was still moving, still happening, just beyond the surface, waiting to be found. Richard stood slowly, the pendant still resting in his palm, its weight no longer just metal but meaning, the kind that pressed into his chest with every breath. The river moved quietly behind him, but now it felt like a witness instead of a backdrop, Ava's words echoing in the space between them. "They come back, not every night, but enough." He turned fully toward her then, his expression no longer guarded in the same way. Something had shifted, something had opened. "When?" he asked, his voice low but focused. Ava glanced toward the bridge, then back to the dark line of the water, calculating not with numbers but with memory. "Late," she said. "When the road is empty and the lights over there go out." She pointed faintly toward the far side where a row of dim street lamps flickered unevenly. Richard followed her gesture, his mind already moving, aligning details, patterns, possibilities. The bodyguard stepped closer, his tone sharper now. "Sir, we need to leave and coordinate this properly. This is not something we handle out here." But Richard did not move, his attention fixed on Ava. "How many times have you seen them?" he pressed. Ava hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, but out of care, as if choosing the right truth mattered more than giving a quick answer. "3, she said finally. "Maybe 4, I do not count nights the way you do." The sentence landed softly, but it carried something deeper, a quiet reminder of how different their worlds were. Richard absorbed it without response, his gaze shifting briefly to the ground, then back to her. "And no one else noticed?" he asked. Ava gave a small shake of her head, her expression unchanged. "People do not look down here," she said. "They drive past." The simplicity of it settled into him, uncomfortable in its clarity. He turned slightly, looking up toward the road they had come from, the faint glow of the limousine still visible in the distance, a piece of his world waiting, controlled, predictable, untouched by what stood in front of him now. The bodyguard followed his gaze, stepping closer again, lowering his voice. "Sir, this could be staged. We need verification, cameras, personnel. We do not act on assumptions." Richard listened this time, but only halfway, the other half of his mind still anchored to the pendant in his hand, to the quiet certainty in Ava's voice, to the absence of anything she had asked for in return. He looked back at her, studying her more closely, the damp strands of hair clinging to her face, the stillness in her posture, the way she stood as if she had already accepted whatever came next. "Why are you still here?" he asked, not accusing, not suspicious, just genuinely asking. Ava blinked once, then answered without hesitation. "Because she looked at me," she said, her voice softer now, but no less steady. "Like she wanted someone to remember." The words did not echo, they settled, deep and quiet, and for a moment, Richard did not move, did not speak. The river continued its slow, steady motion beside them. The bridge above creaked faintly in the wind, and the night seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, not for proof anymore, but for what he would choose to do with it. Richard closed his hand around the pendant, his fingers tightening just enough to anchor himself as the weight of Ava's words settled deeper into his chest. "Because she looked at me, like she wanted someone to remember." He turned slightly toward the river again, his eyes scanning the dark stretch beneath the bridge with a new kind of focus, not searching blindly anymore, but watching, The way someone watches when they know something is coming back. The air had shifted again, colder now, carrying a low breeze that moved across the surface of the water in slow ripples. The bodyguard stepped closer, his voice firm, controlled. "Sir, we need to move back to the vehicle and set up a proper response. This is not the environment for you to stay exposed." Richard remained still for a moment. Longer, then finally straightened fully, his posture no longer uncertain. Something had settled into place, not calm, but direction. "Call them," he said quietly, his eyes still on the river. "But no noise, no lights down here." The bodyguard hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised by the instruction, then nodded, already reaching for his phone. Stepping back a few feet to speak in low, measured tones, Richard turned back to Ava, studying her again. But now there was no distance in his gaze, no dismissal, only recognition. "You said they come back," he said. Ava nodded, her arms still at her sides, her posture unchanged. "Yes," she replied. "They do not stay long." Richard glanced toward the far side again, noting the flickering streetlights Ava had pointed out earlier, their glow uneven, unreliable, like a signal that could disappear at any moment. "Then we wait," he said, more to himself than to her. Ava did not question it, did not react. She simply stepped a little closer to the rocks, positioning herself where she could see both the path and the water, her movements quiet, practiced, as if waiting was something she understood better than most. The minutes stretched slowly, the sound of the river filling the silence between them, the occasional distant hum of a passing car fading quickly before it could reach them. Richard stood with his shoulders squared, the pendant still held firmly in his hand, his mind no longer trying to deny what was in front of him, but preparing for what might come next. Behind him, the bodyguard finished his call and returned, his voice lower now, more controlled. "They are on standby, unmarked. They will hold position until we confirm." Richard gave a small nod, his attention never leaving the water. The night seemed to settle into a strange stillness, the kind that comes just before something shifts. Ava's gaze sharpened slightly, her head tilting just a fraction as if she had heard something no one else had yet, and then, without speaking, she took a slow step forward, her eyes fixed on a point further down the river where the darkness moved differently, not like water, but like something interrupting it. Richard followed her line of sight, his breath slowing, his focus narrowing again, and in that quiet, suspended moment, the space between what had been lost and what might still be found began to close, not with certainty, but with something far more powerful, possibility. The movement was subtle at first, barely more than a shift in the pattern of the water, but Ava saw it before anyone else, her body going still in a way that was not fear, but recognition, her hand lifting slightly without pointing, just enough to guide Richard's attention further down the riverbank, where the darkness seemed to gather, and then part again, as if something had passed through it. Richard stepped forward instinctively, his shoes pressing into the damp ground as his eyes locked onto the same spot, his breath slowing, controlled, the pendant still held tightly in his hand. The bodyguard moved closer as well, his posture tense, ready, but silent now. The faint sound reached them a moment later, not loud, not clear, just enough to break the stillness, the low hum of an engine somewhere beyond the curve of the river, partially hidden by the slope and the bridge above. Ava leaned in slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "That is how it sounds," she said, and Richard felt it then, not doubt, not confusion, but alignment, every piece falling into place with a quiet precision that left no room for denial. He raised his hand slightly, signaling the bodyguard without taking his eyes off the movement ahead. The response was immediate, a soft confirmation spoken into a concealed device. No sirens, no lights, just presence, controlled and unseen. The hum grew a little clearer, then steadied, then faded again, as if whatever had been there was already pulling away, leaving only the ripple of its passing behind. Richard did not move to follow, did not rush forward. He stood still, watching, understanding now that this was not a moment to chase, but a moment to see, to confirm, to know. Ava's gaze remained fixed on the water, her expression unchanged, but there was something quieter in her now, something that suggested this part of the story was no longer hers to carry. The river returned to its slow, steady rhythm, the surface smoothing as if nothing had disturbed it at all. But the air did not return to what it had been, it held on to what had just happened, the evidence of something real, something ongoing. Richard lowered his hand slowly, the signal given, the decision made, he turned to Ava then, fully this time, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but clear in a way it had not been before. "You stay," he said quietly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. Ava met his gaze, her shoulders relaxed now, her voice soft but certain. "Someone had to," she replied, and the simplicity of it settled between them with a weight that did not need to be explained. Richard looked at her for a moment longer, then carefully slid the pendant into his coat pocket. Not to hide it, but to keep it, to carry it forward. The bodyguard approached, his voice low. "They are in position, we can proceed when you are ready." Richard nodded once, then glanced back at the river, the dark stretch beneath the bridge no longer just a place, but a beginning, something that had been overlooked, dismissed, and now could not be ignored. He took a slow breath, the cool air filling his lungs, steadying him, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not control, not certainty, but resolve. "We are not done here," he said, and beside him, Ava did not smile, did not react. She simply turned her gaze back to the water, where the current moved forward without hesitation, as if it had always known that sooner or later someone would finally choose to follow it.